The evening was bright with glittering lights, soft music, and the sound of glasses clinking in celebration. Emily had never been to such a grand event before. The charity gala was filled with the wealthiest people in the city, politicians, celebrities, and, of course, billionaires. She felt out of place in her simple blue dress, but she had come because her best friend had invited her, insisting it would be an unforgettable night. As she walked through the crowd, she tried not to stare too long at the dazzling jewelry, sparkling gowns, and the confident smiles of people who seemed like they belonged in a different world. Emily often felt invisible at such gatherings, and she was perfectly fine blending into the background. But then something happened that pulled her completely out of her comfort zone. Victor Harrington, the billionaire everyone seemed to admire, had just walked to the center of the room. He was tall, dressed in a black tuxedo, his presence commanding attention without him even trying. Guests instantly turned toward him as he raised his champagne glass for a toast. Emily only looked because everyone else did, but her eyes didn't stay on his face for long. They dropped to his hand. Her breath caught. On his finger was a ring, an emerald ring surrounded by small diamonds. For anyone else, it might have looked like just another beautiful piece of jewelry, but for Emily, it was something far more personal. Her heart began to race as she blinked rapidly, making sure she wasn't imagining it. She knew that ring. It wasn't just similar, it was the same ring her mother once wore every day when she was a child. The same ring her mother used to twirl absent-mindedly while telling bedtime stories. The same ring her mother had promised would one day belong to Emily. That ring wasn't just jewelry, it was a piece of her mother's memory, a piece of her love. Emily's hands trembled as she clasped them together. Memories rushed back the night the ring disappeared. She had been only 12 years old. Their home had been broken into while she and her mother were away. When they returned, the place was a mess, and among the missing things was that precious emerald ring. Emily had cried for days, not because of the other stolen items, but because of that one piece that carried so much meaning. Her mother had tried to comfort her, saying, "It's only an object, sweetheart, but I know it hurts because it carried love with it." And now, years later, in a glittering ballroom filled with strangers, Emily saw it again. On the hand of one of the richest men in the country. Her chest felt heavy, as if she couldn't breathe. She wondered if she was mistaken. Could it be a coincidence? After all, there were many emerald rings in the world. But no, this one had a tiny scratch on the side of the band, almost hidden, but visible to her trained eyes. As a child, she used to trace that mark with her finger, amused that something so valuable could still have a flaw. It was unmistakable. Her heart pounded in her ears as she struggled to stay calm. She couldn't look away from the ring, though she knew people might notice her staring. It felt as if time had slowed down, and the rest of the room blurred away. Only the ring existed. Emily's mind filled with questions. How did Victor Harrington get it? Did he know it was stolen? Did he buy it without knowing its history? Or worse, did he not care where it came from? The thought that her mother's cherished ring had traveled through unknown hands, ending up as just another accessory for a billionaire, sent a shiver down her spine. For a moment, she considered walking away, pretending she hadn't seen it. What could she possibly do? She was no one in this grand room, just a guest who didn't even belong. Would anyone believe her if she said the ring had once belonged to her mother? She imagined people laughing, dismissing her as someone desperate for attention or, worse, as a liar. But something inside her refused to let it go. She remembered her mother's warm smile, the gentle way she would touch the ring whenever she was thinking deeply. That ring was more than gold and emerald, it was a reminder of her mother's strength, kindness, and love. Emily couldn't just stand by and let it remain on someone else's hand, even if that someone was untouchable. She bit her lip, her palms sweaty, her mind in a storm. Every instinct told her to keep quiet, but her heart whispered otherwise. She thought of her mother's voice saying, "Never be afraid to stand for what is right, even if your voice shakes." And right now, Emily's voice would definitely shake, but she couldn't deny the truth she carried in her chest. Still frozen in place, she watched Victor lower his glass after finishing his toast. The crowd applauded, but Emily barely heard it. Her eyes stayed on the ring. Every sparkle under the chandelier lights seemed to call out to her, daring her to act. She felt as though fate itself had placed her in this room for a reason. And in that moment, Emily made a silent decision. She would not leave the gala without speaking to him. She had to know the story behind how he got the ring. Whether or not people believed her didn't matter. What mattered was that the truth had been placed right in front of her, and she couldn't turn her back on it. As the music started again and guests began to mingle, Emily's heart beat faster. She knew the next step would change everything. The ring had caught her eye, but it had also awakened a courage she didn't know she still carried within. The music flowed softly in the background, people laughed, glasses clinked, but Emily could hardly hear any of it. Her eyes were locked on that emerald ring. Every beat of her heart seemed louder than the chatter around her. She felt as though she had stumbled into a dream, one that pulled her back into the past and forced her to face memories she thought she had buried. She remembered sitting on her mother's lap as a little girl, her small hands wrapped around that same ring. Her mother would often let her play with it, twirling it around her finger while telling her bedtime stories. Sometimes she would press the emerald gently against Emily's forehead and whisper, "This will be yours one day, my brave girl." Emily had always believed it. That ring was more than jewelry, it was a promise, a treasure filled with love and memory. And yet, it had disappeared in one cruel night. Their home had been broken into. Emily still remembered the smashed drawers, the broken locks, the emptiness that followed. She had been just 12, crying in her mother's arms, asking again and again where the ring had gone. Her mother had tried to comfort her, saying, "It's only a thing. What matters is that we are safe." But Emily had seen the pain in her mother's eyes too. Losing that ring had hurt her mother deeply, though she tried to hide it. Now, years later, here it was. Shining on the hand of Victor Harrington, a man she had never met, a billionaire who seemed worlds away from her. The way the chandelier lights reflected off the emerald made her stomach twist. That stone didn't belong there. It didn't belong in this glittering ballroom or in the hand of a stranger. It belonged with her family, with her mother. Emily's mind raced. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. She studied every detail of the ring, as if trying to prove to herself she wasn't imagining things. The green of the emerald was deep and rich, but what convinced her most was the small flaw, a tiny scratch on the band that no jeweler had ever been able to polish away. As a child, she used to run her finger along it, smiling at the idea that something so beautiful could still be imperfect. That scratch was her proof. This was not just any ring. It was her mother's. The longer she stared, the more her emotions tangled. There was anger, because it felt unfair that a piece of her mother had been taken and turned into a prize for someone else. There was grief, because seeing it again brought back the ache of losing her mother, who had passed away years after the robbery. But there was also fear of what would happen if she spoke up. She thought of walking up to Victor, pointing at the ring, and saying, "That was my mother's." But what then? Would he laugh? Would people think she was lying, trying to make a scene? She was no one important, just another guest. He was a billionaire, respected and admired. Who would they believe? The thought made her palms sweat, and she clutched her small purse tighter. But as much as fear tried to hold her back, something inside her refused to let go. She felt her mother's presence in that moment, as if the universe had brought her here for a reason. It couldn't just be coincidence. Of all the people, of all the rings, of all the nights, why tonight? Why here? Why now? Emily's breathing quickened. She tried to distract herself by looking at the guests around her, but her eyes always found their way back to that green stone. Each sparkle felt like it was calling her name. Her friend noticed her distraction and asked if she was all right, but Emily only nodded, unable to explain what she was feeling. How could she put into words the storm inside her? She thought about the journey the ring must have taken. After it was stolen, who had it first? Did it pass through the hands of criminals, jewelers, collectors? How many people had worn it before it ended up on Victor's hand? Each unknown step made her chest ache, because to her, it wasn't just a piece of jewelry to be traded. It was a part of her mother's story, and now it had become just another item in someone else's collection. But even with all the doubts and fear, Emily felt a growing determination. She couldn't walk away. This wasn't something she could ignore and forget. The ring had been lost for so long, and now it was here, right in front of her eyes. She didn't know what Victor's reaction would be, or what the crowd would think, but deep down she knew she had to speak. She watched as Victor lowered his glass and shook hands with other guests, the emerald flashing under the lights with every movement. Each glimmer seemed to challenge her courage, daring her to take a step forward. Her heart thudded painfully, but she whispered silently to herself, "You have to do this. You owe it to her." Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry, her legs heavy. The ring had caught her eye, but it had also awoken something powerful inside her. A mix of grief, anger, and love swirled together, pushing her toward a decision that would change everything. For years, she had thought the ring was gone forever. Now it was here, and fate had placed her face to face with it. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. She didn't know how she would find the words, but she knew she couldn't leave the ballroom without trying. The ring wasn't just shining under the chandelier, it was shining like a beacon, pulling her toward the truth she could no longer ignore. Emily stood at the edge of the ballroom, her hands cold, her heart racing so fast it almost hurt. For several minutes she had watched Victor Harrington move from guest to guest, greeting people with his confident smile. Every time he lifted his hand, the emerald ring caught the light, reminding her again and again why she couldn't stay silent any longer. She thought of her mother's words that always came back to her in difficult times. Don't be afraid to stand up for the truth, even if your voice shakes. Emily could almost hear her mother's gentle voice guiding her now. Her voice would definitely shake, of that she was certain, but she knew she couldn't leave without speaking up. Gathering every ounce of courage, Emily took a deep breath and started moving across the room. Each step felt heavier than the last. She could hear the sound of her own heels tapping against the marble floor, echoing in her ears. The people around her seemed to fade away. It was just her, the ring, and the man wearing it. When she finally stood in front of Victor, she felt small. He was taller than she expected, his presence strong, and the way others looked at him made it clear he was a man of power. She opened her mouth, but no words came out at first. Her throat tightened, her chest heavy with nerves. For a moment, she considered turning back. But then the ring glimmered again, and her courage returned. She raised her hand slightly, pointing at it. Her voice was soft, but steady enough to be heard. "That ring," she began, pausing as the room seemed to grow quieter around her. "That belonged to my mother." The moment the words left her lips, it was as if the entire ballroom froze. Conversations halted mid-sentence, glasses lowered, even the music seemed distant. Dozens of eyes turned toward Emily, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Victor lowered his glass slowly, his sharp eyes narrowing as he looked at her. For a second, he didn't react at all. The silence stretched so long that Emily thought she had made a mistake, that maybe she shouldn't have spoken. Her face grew hot, and her hands trembled as she held her ground. But then Victor spoke, his voice calm, deep, and curious. "What did you say?" Emily swallowed hard, her mouth dry. She forced herself to repeat, louder this time, though her voice shook. "That ring, it belonged to my mother. I know it. I recognize it." The guests whispered among themselves, the sound spreading like ripples through the crowd. Some raised their brows, others exchanged doubtful glances, as if they couldn't believe someone so ordinary would dare to confront a man like Victor in the middle of such a glamorous event. Victor glanced at the ring, then back at Emily. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, surprise, maybe, or confusion. Slowly, he lifted his hand, studying the emerald under the chandelier light as if seeing it for the first time. The silence in the room grew heavier. Emily could feel her heart pounding against her ribs, threatening to break free. She didn't know what he would say, and part of her feared he might laugh at her, dismiss her in front of everyone. But she stood firm, because the truth was on her side. Finally, he spoke again, his tone lower this time. "What was your mother's name?" The question caught Emily off guard. She hadn't expected him to take her seriously, but his voice carried no mockery. It was steady, curious, almost cautious. For a moment, she couldn't speak, her mind racing back through memories. Then she found her voice. "Catherine," she said softly. "Catherine Wilson." At the mention of her mother's name, her chest tightened. She remembered her mother's laugh, her warm hugs, the way she used to hold her hand whenever Emily felt scared. Saying her name out loud in that grand ballroom felt both painful and powerful, as if her mother's spirit had been called into the room. Victor didn't speak right away. He studied Emily's face carefully, his sharp gaze searching her eyes for something. The room remained silent, filled only with the soft hum of whispers among the guests who were watching closely. Emily didn't look away. Her eyes stayed fixed on him, her body trembling but her will unshaken. She wanted him to see the truth in her eyes, to understand that this wasn't some desperate claim, it was her life, her mother's memory. For the first time that evening, Victor's confident smile faded. His lips pressed into a thin line, and his brow furrowed ever so slightly. It was a tiny change, but it was enough to send another wave of tension through the crowd. The billionaire, usually so composed and untouchable, looked unsettled. Emily's heart leapt with a mix of hope and fear. Hope, because maybe he would believe her. Fear, because she didn't know what would come next. Around them, the ballroom felt heavier than ever. Guests leaned closer, some pretending to sip their drinks but clearly too eager to miss a single word. Even the waiters carrying trays had slowed their steps, listening carefully. Emily had done it. She had spoken. She had pointed to the ring and said the words she thought she would never say. Her voice had shaken, her hands had trembled, but she had stood her ground. What happened next was no longer in her control. It was in Victor's hands now. The air in the ballroom felt heavy, almost too heavy to breathe. Emily stood frozen, her heart pounding so loudly she thought everyone around her could hear it. She had said the words out loud, words that had taken all her courage. That ring belonged to my mother. Now there was no taking them back. For a moment, the silence stretched so long it felt endless. People stared, some wide-eyed, some whispering behind their hands. A few guests tilted their heads toward one another, their expressions filled with curiosity and disbelief. Nobody expected something like this to happen at a glamorous event where the night was supposed to be about charity, laughter, and celebration. Victor Harrington still hadn't replied. He stood tall, his glass of champagne now lowered, his hand with the emerald ring hanging at his side. His eyes were fixed on Emily, not with anger, but with something far more unsettling, silence. He seemed to be studying her, weighing her words, testing her courage. The crowd expected him to laugh it off, to wave away her claim with a quick smile. They were waiting for him to dismiss her, to put her in her place. After all, he was a billionaire, the center of attention, a man who never had to explain himself. She was just another face in the crowd, someone ordinary who didn't belong among the polished elites of the room. But he didn't dismiss her. He didn't smile. He didn't laugh. He simply asked, in a voice that was calm but carried enough weight to silence even the whispers, "What was your mother's name?" The question rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. People exchanged looks, surprised that he had taken her words seriously. Emily's breath caught. Her voice trembled as she answered, "Catherine Wilson." At the sound of the name, Victor's face changed. It was subtle, but Emily saw it, the slight tightening of his jaw, the narrowing of his eyes, the pause before he moved again. For a man known for being unreadable, this small crack in his composure was startling. The silence in the room grew deeper. Emily could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her, watching to see what would happen next. Her hands trembled, but she didn't look away. She held Victor's gaze, even though her knees felt weak, even though she wanted to melt into the floor. Victor finally looked down at the ring. He turned his hand slowly, as if examining it for the first time in years. The emerald caught the light again, flashing brilliantly, but now there was something heavier in the way he studied it. Emily's chest tightened. She thought he might deny it, might tell her she was mistaken, that she didn't know what she was talking about. But instead, he stayed quiet. Too quiet. The guests around them shifted uncomfortably. The music from the band continued, soft and distant, but no one was listening. The entire room seemed to be holding its breath. Emily's friend stepped closer, ready to pull her away, but Emily lifted a hand slightly, stopping her. She couldn't run now. She had spoken, and she had to see this through. Finally, Victor lifted his eyes from the ring and looked back at Emily. His voice, when he spoke, was steady but strangely softer than before. "And how do you know this ring was hers?" Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry, but she found the strength to answer. Because I grew up watching her wear it. Because I used to trace the little scratch on the band when I was a child. Because she told me it would be mine one day. A murmur swept through the crowd at her words. Some gasped, some shook their heads, and others leaned closer, eager for more. Victor didn't say anything immediately, but the slight flicker in his eyes betrayed his surprise. He hadn't expected such detail. For a man like him, who lived in a world of deals and power, perhaps he had never been confronted with something so personal, so raw, and so filled with truth. The silence dragged on, almost unbearable. Emily's heart thudded painfully in her chest, but she stood tall, her voice still trembling yet firm. That ring isn't just jewelry to me. It's a piece of my mother. And I would recognize it anywhere. The crowd seemed stunned. They had come expecting a night of glamour, but instead they were watching something real, something heavy unfold before their eyes. Even those who doubted her felt the sincerity in her words. Victor finally exhaled, as though he had been holding his breath all along. He lowered his gaze once more to the ring, and for the first time since the evening began, the confident billionaire looked uncertain. Nobody expected that. Guests exchanged whispers again, but this time their voices carried or rather than disbelief. It was shocking enough that Emily had spoken up, but it was even more shocking that Victor hadn't brushed her off, that he was actually listening. Emily's chest rose and fell as she tried to steady herself. She didn't know what his silence meant, but she knew one thing: she had broken through the perfect surface of the evening. She had forced him, and everyone else, to confront the truth hiding behind that emerald's shine. And in that heavy silence, in the stunned stillness of the ballroom, Emily realized she had already done something incredible. She had stood up. She had spoken. She had been heard. What Victor would do next, she didn't know. But the weight of his reaction, the way the crowd had fallen into complete silence, proved one thing: her words had struck deeper than anyone had expected. Emily stood trembling, the weight of the moment pressing on her shoulders. She had said her mother's name, Catherine Wilson, and revealed the details only a daughter would know. The crowd was still hushed, every guest leaning forward, waiting for Victor's response. For a long moment, Victor said nothing. His fingers brushed the emerald lightly, as if he were remembering something. Then he looked at Emily again, and for the first time, there was no distance in his eyes. There was curiosity, and maybe even recognition of her pain. Emily felt her throat tighten. Memories of her mother rushed through her mind, her gentle laughter, her bedtime stories, the way she always smelled faintly of jasmine. And most of all, the way she would turn that ring gently on her finger when she was lost in thought. The memory was so vivid that Emily's eyes stung with tears. My mother, Emily began, her voice quiet but firm, was everything to me. She was strong, kind, and she always tried to protect me from pain, even when she was hurting herself. That ring, it wasn't just jewelry to her. It was part of her story. She wore it every day of her life until the night it disappeared. A murmur swept through the guests, who had grown restless. Now, many of them were touched by the rawness in her tone. The gala, meant for celebration, had turned into something far deeper. Emily took a shaky breath, pushing herself to continue. The night it was stolen, I was 12. I remember coming home with her and seeing the front door broken. I remember the drawers pulled open, our things scattered everywhere. And I remember searching for the ring, but it was gone. I cried for days. My mother told me to be strong, that it was only an object, but I could see in her eyes how much it hurt her too. Victor listened silently. His hand didn't move from the ring, and his face remained unreadable, but something in the set of his jaw had changed. He looked less certain, less untouchable. Emily's voice softened as she went on. She used to tell me that one day, when I was older, she would give me the ring. She said it would remind me of her love, no matter where life took me. But she never got the chance. Years later, I lost her too. And now, Emily's words faltered, her voice trembling. Now I see it here, on your hand, and it feels like I'm looking at a piece of her I thought I'd never see again. Her words hung in the air, heavy with grief and longing. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the sound of the orchestra playing softly in the background. Even the servers had stopped moving, caught in the spell of her story. Victor finally spoke, his tone quieter than before. You say this was your mother's. And you are certain? Emily nodded, her eyes shimmering with tears. I am certain. I'd know it anywhere. The emerald, the setting, even the tiny scratch on the band. I used to trace it with my finger when I was a child. You could show me 100 rings, and I'd still know this one. The conviction in her voice made the crowd shift again. Some guests whispered in awe, others exchanged doubtful glances. But no one could deny the sincerity shining in Emily's eyes. Victor studied her carefully. Then he turned the ring slowly, the emerald catching the chandelier's glow. For a moment, his face was thoughtful, almost troubled. He looked like a man searching through his own memories. Emily's chest ached. She didn't know what his silence meant. Would he deny it? Would he accuse her of lying? Or would he admit that her words had shaken something in him? I remember when I first saw this ring, Victor said at last. His voice was low, as though speaking more to himself than to the crowd. It was at an auction years ago. They called it a rare piece, said it had been passed through collectors. They never mentioned where it came from before that. Emily's stomach twisted. Auction. Collectors. It made sense. The ring had vanished into the shadows, bought and sold like any other item, stripped of its meaning. But to her, it had never been just an object. Her voice cracked as she spoke again. Maybe they didn't tell you the truth. But I know it. That ring has a story, and it doesn't begin at an auction. It begins with my mother. Victor's eyes met hers again, and this time, he didn't look away. The silence between them was electric, filled with something no one else in the room could fully understand. It wasn't just about wealth or power anymore, it was about memory, love, and loss. Emily's hands trembled at her sides. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if she had opened her heart for the world to see. But she didn't regret it. She couldn't. This was her chance, maybe her only one, to fight for a piece of her mother's legacy. The crowd remained still, watching intently. Some were touched, others skeptical, but all of them knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. It was no longer a simple party. It was a confrontation between truth and silence, between memory and wealth. Emily drew in a shaky breath, her eyes never leaving Victor's. I don't want to embarrass you. I don't want to accuse you of anything. But that ring doesn't belong here. It belongs with me. It's the last piece of her I have left. The words echoed in the ballroom, soft yet powerful. And for the first time that night, Victor Harrington, the man who always seemed untouchable, looked shaken. The ballroom was silent, as if every sound had been swallowed by Emily's words. She stood there, trembling but unshaken, while Victor Harrington stared at the emerald ring on his hand. The crowd waited, leaning in, their curiosity burning. Nobody knew what he would say, not even Emily. Victor finally let out a long breath. His face was calm, but his eyes carried something different now, something heavier. He lifted the ring closer, turning it slowly between his fingers. The emerald sparkled, but for once, its shine didn't seem to impress him. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear enough for everyone to hear. I bought this ring almost 10 years ago, he said. It was at a private auction in London. The catalogue described it as a rare piece with an uncertain past. They said it had been owned by collectors, passed around, but nobody could trace its first owner. The guests stirred, whispering quickly among themselves. Some nodded as if the explanation made sense. Others looked at Emily, wondering how she would react. Victor went on, his tone steadier now. At the time, I thought nothing of it. I assumed it was just another jewel, like so many others I've purchased over the years. I never asked too many questions. To me, it was an acquisition, a part of my collection. Emily's chest tightened at his words. An acquisition. For him, it had been a beautiful object to own. For her, it was the last memory of her mother. The contrast cut deep, but she stayed silent, letting him speak. Victor's eyes flickered briefly toward her, as if searching for understanding. I didn't know, he said more firmly this time. I didn't know it was stolen. I didn't know it had belonged to your mother. Emily's lips parted, but she couldn't find her voice. His words weren't an excuse, they sounded like a confession. He was admitting that the story she had told had shaken him, that it carried a truth he could no longer ignore. The crowd whispered louder now, filling the room with a low buzz. Some were astonished that a man like Victor Harrington would admit such a thing in front of everyone. Others were skeptical, wondering if this was just his way of protecting his reputation. But Emily wasn't thinking about the crowd. Her eyes were fixed on Victor, her heart pounding as she tried to process his words. Victor lowered his gaze to the ring once more. His thumb brushed over the band, pausing for a moment on the tiny scratch. For years, he had probably never noticed it. But now, after hearing Emily's story, even that little flaw carried weight. It was proof that the ring had a history deeper than he had imagined. I have spent much of my life surrounded by wealth, he continued, his tone heavier now. Jewels, art, rare objects, they pass through my hands like shadows. I never thought about where they came from. To me, they were simply possessions. But tonight, he paused, his jaw tightening. Tonight, I realize some things cannot be measured by money. The words struck Emily's heart like a spark. She could see it now, the shift in him. He wasn't dismissing her. He wasn't mocking her. He was admitting, in front of everyone, that he had been blind to the truth. Her voice, soft but trembling, finally broke through. It wasn't just a ring to her. It was part of her life, part of our story. And when it was stolen, it felt like a piece of her was stolen too. Victor met her eyes. For the first time, the room seemed to disappear around them. It was no longer billionaire and stranger, no longer rich man and ordinary guest. It was just two people connected by a single object that carried the weight of memory, loss, and love. He let out another slow breath. I believe you, he said at last. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some covered their mouths, stunned that Victor Harrington, the man known for his pride, his power, and his unshakable confidence, had admitted such a thing publicly. Emily's heart raced. She hadn't expected him to say it so plainly, to acknowledge her truth in front of everyone. Relief and disbelief mingled inside her, leaving her almost breathless. Victor glanced down at the ring again. He turned it one final time, as though saying goodbye to it, before slipping it off his finger. The simple motion was small, but the meaning was immense. The crowd watched in silence, shocked by what they were seeing. Victor held the ring in his palm, staring at it for a moment before speaking again. This ring was never truly mine. It carried a story I did not know, a story that belongs to you. His voice was steady, but there was a weight of regret behind it. If what you say is true, then I have been wearing someone else's memory, someone else's love, without even knowing. Emily's eyes blurred with tears. She had prepared herself for disbelief, for mockery, even for rejection. But she had never imagined this. The crowd stayed silent, waiting for what would happen next. Every eye was on Victor, every breath held, as if the entire room had been swept into the tide of this moment. And then, slowly, Victor extended his hand, the hand holding the emerald ring, toward Emily. Victor held out the ring, resting in the center of his palm, the emerald glowing under the soft light of the chandeliers. For a second, Emily thought her legs might give way. She stared at it, unable to believe what was happening. The same ring she had cried over as a child, the one she had thought was gone forever, was now being offered back to her. The crowd watched in stunned silence. People leaned forward, holding their breath, as though they too couldn't believe what they were seeing. The billionaire, known for his pride and his obsession with rare treasures, was giving something away, and not just any jewel, but one that had been part of his personal collection for years. Emily's chest tightened as tears welled in her eyes. Her heart pounded so hard she could barely hear the whispers circling the room. She lifted her trembling hand slowly, almost afraid this moment would vanish if she moved too quickly. Her fingers hovered above the ring, her mind racing. Take it, Victor said quietly, his voice steady but softer than anyone had ever heard it before. This was never mine to keep. Emily's breath hitched. She wanted to speak, to thank him, but her throat felt tight, as though every word had been trapped by emotion. Her vision blurred as she looked down at the ring. The emerald sparkled, but beneath its shine, she saw something no one else in the room could: her mother's hand, her mother's smile, her mother's love. Her fingers closed around the ring at last. The cool metal pressed into her palm, and with it came a flood of memories so strong she almost broke down right there. She remembered sitting on her mother's lap, the warmth of her laughter, the soft promise that one day the ring would be hers. She remembered the night it had been stolen, the tears, the helplessness. And now, years later, it was back in her hands. The moment felt unreal, like a scene pulled out of a dream. The crowd gasped quietly, some in awe, others in disbelief. A few women dabbed their eyes with tissues, touched by the emotion of it all. Even the men who prided themselves on being cold and businesslike stood still, moved by the unexpected tenderness of the gesture. Emily finally found her voice, though it trembled. I don't know what to say. Victor's eyes softened, though his face remained composed. Say nothing, he replied gently. Just know that it belongs with you. Not with me. Emily closed her fingers tighter around the ring, clutching it to her chest as though it might disappear if she let go. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away, embarrassed by the flood of emotion. But nobody laughed. Nobody judged. The room was filled with respect for her courage, respect for her pain, and respect for the moment that had just unfolded. Victor stepped back slightly, his hand now empty. 4 years, the emerald had been a shining part of his collection, a symbol of his wealth. But as he looked at Emily, he realized he had gained something far more valuable in that moment, a sense of humanity he had long forgotten. The music, which had been distant and forgotten, slowly began to drift back into the room. But the atmosphere had changed completely. The gala no longer felt like a night of glamour, it felt like a night people would never forget. Emily turned the ring in her hand, her eyes catching on the tiny scratch on the band. She smiled through her tears. That small imperfection, which others might overlook, was what made her so sure it was real. It was her proof, her connection, her memory made whole again. She looked at Victor, her voice soft but filled with sincerity. Thank you. You don't know what this means to me. Victor nodded once. His voice was quiet, but it carried to everyone. No, I think I do. The crowd erupted in soft murmurs once more. Some applauded quietly, others shook their heads in astonishment. It was rare, almost unheard of, for a man like Victor Harrington to show such humility, such humanity, in front of so many. Emily's heart swelled with gratitude, but also with something deeper, a sense of closure she had never expected to feel. 4 years, she had carried the pain of losing that ring, the pain of losing a piece of her mother. And now, here it was, back where it belonged. She slipped the ring onto her finger, her hands still trembling. The emerald fit perfectly, as though it had been waiting all this time to return to her. She looked down at it, then closed her eyes for a moment, whispering silently in her heart, "It's back, Mom. It's really back." The ring sparkled under the lights, but to Emily, its shine came from something deeper than the stone itself. It came from memory, from love, from the connection between a daughter and her mother that not even time, theft, or fate could break. Victor stepped aside, letting the moment belong fully to her. His usually sharp, commanding presence seemed softer now, humbled by the weight of what he had just done. For him, letting go of the ring was more than generosity, it was an acknowledgement that some things could never be owned, only cherished by the right hands. The crowd remained in awe, whispering to each other about what they had just witnessed. They had come expecting wealth, glamour, and power, but instead, they had seen something rare, a billionaire surrendering a treasure, and a young woman reclaiming a piece of her past. And as Emily stood there, the ring gleaming on her hand, the room seemed to recognize that they had witnessed not just a gesture, but a moment of healing. The ballroom was still filled with silence, but it wasn't the same silence from before. This silence was heavier, deeper, charged with emotions that everyone in the room could feel. All eyes were on Emily, who now stood with the emerald ring shining on her finger. The same ring that had once slipped away from her life had returned, and the weight of that truth left everyone unable to speak. Then, slowly, a murmur spread through the crowd. People whispered to one another, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others pressing their hands over their hearts as if they themselves had been touched by the moment. It was rare to see something so raw and human in a world where wealth and pride usually ruled over compassion. Emily stood still, her chest rising and falling with deep, uneven breaths. She was holding back tears, her heart beating as if it wanted to leap out of her chest. The ring glimmered under the golden chandelier light, but its shine was nothing compared to the warmth it brought to her soul. She turned it gently on her finger, tracing the small scratch on the band again, the very mark that told her it was truly hers, truly her mother's. From the corner of the room, a woman's voice broke the silence. "That was beautiful." Her words, soft but heartfelt, carried across the space, and soon others nodded in agreement. A quiet ripple of applause began, hesitant at first, then growing louder, until the ballroom echoed with the sound of clapping hands. But this applause was not for the wealth, not for the grandeur of the event, not even for the billionaire who had given up his jewel. It was for the truth, for the power of memory, for the courage of a daughter who spoke up and the humility of a man who chose compassion over pride. Victor Harrington stood slightly apart now, his expression unreadable but softer than anyone had ever seen. The applause wasn't for him, and he didn't want it to be. He had given the ring back, yes, but he knew in his heart that it was only the right thing to do. What mattered was not the applause, it was the look on Emily's face as she held her mother's treasure close again. Emily felt the tears she had been holding back finally slip down her cheeks. She quickly brushed them away, embarrassed, but people in the crowd only smiled kindly. For once, she didn't feel small or out of place among all the glittering gowns and expensive jewels. For once, she felt seen. One guest leaned toward another and whispered, "Imagine carrying that kind of loss for years, and then having it returned in front of everyone." The other nodded, their eyes still fixed on Emily. "It's like fate brought her here tonight," they replied. Emily herself wondered the same. What were the chances? She hadn't planned on confronting Victor Harrington. She hadn't even expected to see the ring. Yet, by some strange twist of destiny, she had. And now, standing there with it back on her hand, she felt something shift inside her. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it had softened. She felt lighter, as if a burden she had carried silently for years had finally been lifted. Victor cleared his throat gently, and the applause quieted. He looked at Emily and said, in a voice steady enough for everyone to hear, "Tonight, I learned something no amount of money could ever teach me. Possessions may shine, but it is memories, love, and truth that truly matter." The crowd fell quiet again. His words, simple yet honest, struck something in each person there. Many of them were people who had lived their lives chasing wealth, power, and glittering objects. But in that moment, they were reminded of something more important: human connection. Emily turned her gaze toward Victor. She didn't hate him, in fact, she felt gratitude. He had given her back more than just a piece of jewelry. He had given her back a part of her mother, a piece of her childhood, a link to the woman she had loved more than anyone. And though she had expected resistance, anger, maybe even ridicule, what she had received instead was understanding and compassion. She nodded at him softly, whispering, "Thank you," once more, though the words felt too small for what she truly felt. Victor returned the nod. "It belongs with you," he said simply, and with that, he stepped back, disappearing slightly into the crowd, as though giving Emily the moment completely. The gala slowly resumed, music rising again, waiters moving quietly with trays of champagne. But the atmosphere was different now. Guests didn't just talk about business, money, or power. They spoke about what they had just witnessed, shaking their heads in amazement. Some said they would never forget this night, not because of the wealth on display, but because of the humanity they had seen. Emily stood quietly, still staring at the ring on her finger. She could almost feel her mother's presence beside her, as though she were smiling down, proud of her daughter's courage and strength. For Emily, it was more than just getting back a jewel. It was healing, closure, and a reminder that love never truly disappears. And as she looked around the ballroom, filled with strangers who had just shared this deeply personal moment with her, she realized something else too. Sometimes life brings back what you've lost when you least expect it. Sometimes, even in a world full of wealth and power, miracles can happen. That night, people would leave the gala talking about Victor Harrington. Yes, but not about his money, his collection, or his status. They would speak about how a young woman pointed to a ring and said, "That belonged to my mother," and how, against all expectations, a billionaire's response had left everyone speechless. And for Emily, it would always remain the night when her mother's memory, carried in a small emerald ring, finally returned to her hand and her heart.